Gilead looks invincible. That is the illusion the regime depends on: the uniforms, the rituals, the executions, the walls, the fear. Everything about Gilead is designed to create one message in people's minds: resistance is impossible. But what if the terrifying truth is that Gilead is not actually becoming stronger anymore? What if it is already collapsing from the inside? Because when you really pay attention to the Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments, you start realizing something disturbing. The people running Gilead no longer believe in it themselves, and that changes everything. Because history has proven something over and over again. The moment a dictatorship starts relying more on fear than belief, its collapse already begins. And honestly, that may already be happening to Gilead. Not through one giant rebellion, not through a massive war, but through slow internal decay, spreading through every level of the system itself. Gilead was never built to last. One of the biggest misconceptions about Gilead is assuming it was designed for long-term stability. It was not. Gilead was built as a reaction, a desperate attempt to regain control during societal collapse. Falling birth rates, environmental disaster, political panic, cultural fear. The commanders did not create Gilead because they had a perfect vision for the future. They created it because they were terrified of losing power. That is important. Because systems built through fear and desperation almost always contain the seeds of their own destruction. And Gilead is filled with contradictions. It claims morality while operating through brutality. It claims order while constantly creating chaos underneath the surface. It claims purity while its leaders secretly break their own laws. That hypocrisy matters more than people realize. Because authoritarian systems survive through perception. The moment people stop believing the system is legitimate, the structure begins cracking internally. And Gilead's cracks are everywhere now. The commanders no longer believe their own rules. This may be the clearest sign Gilead is already collapsing. The people at the top no longer fully follow the ideology themselves. That is catastrophic for any authoritarian regime. Commander Waterford preached morality while secretly exploiting women. Other commanders constantly violated the laws they publicly enforced. Even inside Gilead's highest circles, corruption spreads everywhere, and that reveals something terrifying. Gilead's leaders do not truly believe in righteousness anymore. They believe in survival, power, control. That shift changes everything. Because once leaders stop believing in the system emotionally, the system becomes performative instead of ideological. People begin pretending instead of believing. Fear replaces loyalty, and fear is unstable. Eventually, fear creates resentment. Then resentment creates rebellion. The women of Gilead are becoming the system's greatest threat. One of the smartest details in the Testaments is showing how Gilead accidentally created the exact people who may eventually destroy it. It's women, especially the ants. At first, the ants seem completely loyal to the regime. But the deeper the story goes, the more complicated that becomes. Because women inside Gilead see the truth more clearly than anyone else. They witness the hypocrisy directly, the abuse, the manipulation, the corruption hiding underneath the religious language. And over time, knowledge becomes dangerous, especially in authoritarian systems, because dictatorships survive by controlling information. But once enough people inside the system understand the truth, collapse becomes inevitable. Aunt Lydia represents this perfectly. She begins as somebody trying to survive inside Gilead. But eventually she becomes something far more dangerous. A witness. And witnesses terrify authoritarian governments more than soldiers do. Because soldiers can fight rebellions, but they cannot stop truth once it spreads internally. Fear is no longer working the same way. At the beginning of Gilead, fear was effective. People were shocked, disoriented, terrified. That allowed the regime to establish control quickly. But fear changes over time. Eventually, people adapt to it. And that is one of the biggest problems authoritarian governments always face. Once suffering becomes normal, fear loses some of its power. People stop expecting safety, which means they also stop believing obedience guarantees survival. That is dangerous for Gilead. Because once people emotionally accept that the system may destroy them no matter what, resistance suddenly becomes less frightening. And you can already feel that psychological shift happening. Characters who once stayed silent begin taking risks. Secret alliances form. Information moves underground. People begin thinking long-term instead of simply surviving day to day. That is how collapse begins, quietly, psychologically, long before governments physically fall. Gilead's biggest weakness is isolation. Another major reason Gilead is already collapsing is because isolation slowly destroys authoritarian systems from within. Gilead survives by cutting itself off, controlling movement, controlling media, controlling knowledge. But isolation creates stagnation. It limits innovation. It weakens adaptability. And most importantly, it creates paranoia. The more authoritarian systems isolate themselves, the more they begin fearing internal betrayal. That is exactly what starts happening in Gilead. Nobody fully trusts anyone anymore. The commanders spy on each other. The eyes watch everyone constantly. Even loyal citizens live in fear of suspicion. And systems built entirely on paranoia eventually consume themselves. Because trust disappears completely. Without trust, institutions weaken. Without institutions, governments collapse. And Gilead is slowly reaching that point. The younger generation changes everything. This may actually be the biggest reason Gilead's future is doomed. The younger generation does not fully share the same emotional connection to the regime's founding ideology. That matters enormously. The original leaders of Gilead were driven by fear and religious extremism. But younger people raised inside the system begin questioning things differently, especially once they encounter contradictions. That is why education and information become so dangerous in the Testaments. Because younger generations are harder to fully control forever, eventually curiosity breaks through indoctrination. And once younger people stop emotionally believing in the system, collapse accelerates rapidly. History proves this constantly. Authoritarian governments often survive one generation through fear, but maintaining absolute control across multiple generations becomes almost impossible, especially once hypocrisy becomes obvious. And in Gilead, hypocrisy is everywhere. Aunt Lydia may already know Gilead cannot survive. One of the most fascinating parts of the Testaments is realizing Aunt Lydia may already understand Gilead's fate long before everyone else, because Lydia sees everything. She understands how corrupted the commanders truly are. She understands how unstable the system has become. And most importantly, she understands history. That makes her incredibly dangerous, because intelligent people inside collapsing systems often become the first ones preparing for what comes next. Not because they suddenly become heroes, because they understand survival. And Lydia is a survivor, which means her actions increasingly feel less like loyalty to Gilead, and more like preparation for its eventual downfall. That is terrifying, because once key figures inside authoritarian systems start quietly planning beyond the regime itself, collapse becomes much harder to stop. The most important sign of collapse. But honestly, the clearest proof Gilead is already collapsing may be emotional rather than political. Nobody seems truly hopeful anymore, not even the people in power. The commanders look paranoid. The citizens look exhausted. The women look emotionally numb. Everything feels increasingly hollow. And that emotional emptiness matters, because successful societies require belief in the future. Gilead no longer inspires belief, only endurance. And systems built entirely on endurance eventually run out of emotional energy. That is when collapse accelerates, not always through explosions or revolutions, sometimes through exhaustion, through people quietly giving up on the idea that the system deserves to survive. At first glance, Gilead still looks powerful. The laws remain brutal. The punishments remain terrifying. The system still controls millions of lives. But underneath the surface, something is rotting. The commanders no longer fully believe in their own ideology. Fear is losing effectiveness. The younger generation is beginning to question the system. Internal paranoia keeps spreading. And the women of Gilead increasingly understand the truth behind the regime, which means the most terrifying thing about Gilead may not be its power. It may be how fragile that power already is. Because history shows that authoritarian systems rarely collapse all at once. They decay slowly from the inside until eventually one moment exposes how weak they truly became. And honestly, Gilead may already be much closer to that moment than anyone realizes.